All right, we're back on air with episode number two of the show that we have not yet named. But
We do have to
episode
think of
number
that
two,
still.
yeah, we did. But today we have an interesting and topical discussion around TikTok, which probably everyone listening to this at least has some familiarity with and knows that it is currently undergoing a potential ban in the United States. Viv, do you use TikTok?
So I did for a little bit. I mean, you probably know this about me. I'm a bit of a technological curmudgeon in some ways. I don't have social media, don't have Facebook, I don't have Instagram, I don't have Snapchat. I did have TikTok for a little bit, but I deleted it actually because I didn't really like the behaviors it was bringing out in myself. Essentially, I read The Anxious Generation, I think by Jonathan Haidt. And he has this part where he talks about how the algorithm is intended to give you little hits of dopamine and but not always so that you are incentivized to keep scrolling and kind of like your eyes glaze over and that kind of stuff. And I felt that very much with myself and I just didn't appreciate that. So yeah, so I deleted it. But now I know that I'm very far away from a lot of, what is happening in social discourse. So I'm curious, do you use it? What is the latest news, latest trends? What's going on TikTok right now?
I use TikTok. I'm on it. I'm not a power user by any means. I'm still kind of, I think where my millennialness comes in is that I'm more on Instagram than I am on TikTok. But I do think that they are very different types of social media platforms. And what TikTok did for this generation, which you can talk about the downsides, the anxiety, all of that, as much as that is true, I think it also brought in authenticity. Like for me, prior to TikTok, we didn't have authenticity on social media. Instagram is very much a highlight reel of your life, and
Yeah,
more
it's
and more
true.
so, it's becoming like a magazine. It's very aesthetic and kind of like beautiful picture focused. Whereas TikTok brought in true, like unmakeup, authentic takes, the whole remixes, all of that. So that I think is pretty special. But because you didn't have TikTok, I think now you can't download it anymore. If I don't know if you've tried.
I haven't. I did waver for a moment. I thought to myself if I should just download it before the ban took place and then I can make a decision later. But I decided to stay strong and continue my my abstention.
Yeah.
But I heard that I did hear that TikTok sort of voluntarily shut off their services prior to the ban, and but now the ban has been extended, or they've been given an extended time frame. But yeah, what's the mood on the app?
They did turn it off and I opened it and I saw the message, which was due to government whatever, TikTok is not available. And then the next day it was back online and there was some message like thanks to the efforts of President Trump or whatever. It was a little almost like too it was like a little China in the I guess praise a
Mm.
little bit, just a little bit of that tone. But it was really amusing for anyone who's not on TikTok. It was really amusing before the ban actually happened, the kind of stuff that was being shared, almost like making fun of the whole ban. But
Mm.
there were a lot of videos that were like to my personal Chinese spy, people sharing, they're like making joke videos, were sharing like there's hair samples and saliva samples like to be mailed to their Chinese spy. And there was
It's pretty
also a lot
funny.
of, I know, pretty funny. There's also a lot of movement to another Chinese
Mm.
app, which you might know about. It's called Xiaohongshu, or I think
Hmm.
they go by Red Note in the US, maybe to not sound like Little Red Book, which is
Yeah, yeah,
literally
which
what
has
it's
different
called.
connotations, right? Or specific
Yeah.
connotations. Yeah.
Yeah, but Red Note is actually owned by at least partially, I'm not sure completely, by the PRC, the People's Republic of China,
Mm.
and it was a number one downloaded app the past maybe 2 weeks in the App Store as TikTok users were refugees flying to Red
I
Note.
did hear that term, TikTok refugees. I thought that was very
Exactly.
clever.
Yeah. And then in TikTok, there were all these reviews of Red Note, like, oh, like, and what I kind of, I watched a few of them. What I kind of gathered from the reviews of Americans on Red Note was like, wow, the Chinese videos are like next level in terms of their editing, in terms of like the quality of content.
Mhm.
There was so many jokes about like I'm trying to learn Chinese now, like ni hao and all of this. So in classic TikTok fashion, it created another meme, really.
Yeah. I did see funny jokes about people saying that they would rather learn Mandarin than go back to using Facebook.
I
Which
mean, yeah, that being that I do know Mandarin, I would agree
it's
with
very
that.
difficult. Yeah, but it's a very difficult language.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've also seen some funny interactions because I think this is the first time you've actually had Chinese internet users or kind of social media users mingling with American social media users for the first time because everything else is split, right? China has its own ecosystem of social media apps. They're not allowed to use the ones that we use in the US, and US users have never had a reason to go on the Chinese apps before. But this is the first time you're seeing, I think, people interacting with each other and mingling. And from what I've heard, the response is generally positive. Like there's been some very nice, like I think Red Note has been quite welcoming to these TikTok refugees. And yeah, so I think that's an interesting dynamic. We'll see what comes out of that.
Yeah, but that is super interesting. I didn't think about it that way,
Mhm.
that this is really one of the very, very few platforms where Chinese people, mainland China, is interacting
Mhm.
with America. That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, because I think so much of what, people hear is through the news, through media, official media channels, and then through obviously government kind of, policies and what reasons the government is giving for making those policies, which are largely, I think, quite negative, at least in recent years, for both sides. I think it's been quite mutually negative. But I think we sort of forget that there are millions and in China, billions of people behind kind of these giant entities. And yeah, the people have actually had very little opportunity to interact with each other. And I think what people tend to find is that we have more in common typically than it
Yeah.
may seem on the outset. And so yeah, I think this could be interesting for how both sides feel about each other. Yeah.
Until I think what the government would do or Rednote would do is split again the IP addresses and create
And then
two
create
separate.
two. Yeah, yeah, that's true. The
Yeah,
Chinese government intentionally does not want
this
foreigners on
happening.
the yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe let's backtrack a little bit. Why is the US government interested in banning TikTok? And I'm also curious why this evolved the way that it has from Trump first declaring this ban in 2020, then it didn't happen, and now fast forward it became Biden, and now Trump's back. So, but I guess why is it happening?
Yeah, I mean the big tagline is national security, right? But this is really unprecedented. Like the US has never done this before. And the premises is based off of national security. And you've had, congressional hearings, I think like very famously the CEO of TikTok gave like a 5 hour congressional, hearing and things like that. But and to my knowledge, there hasn't been any evidence that TikTok or ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, has been collecting this data for certain nefarious reasons, right? That's the fear, is that the data on users, whether that's their locations, their contacts, their messages, their preferences, et cetera, could be collected or is being collected by TikTok and ByteDance, and that this could be accessed and leveraged by the Chinese government. And to my knowledge, for independent studies that have been commissioned, there hasn't been any evidence of this. The data is being collected, but not really necessarily more so than through, any of the other social media apps, right, that track all of this, basic information about you. So there's nothing, outside of what is being already done by other social media platforms. Yeah, to my knowledge. But I think the issue that they're running into is that there isn't necessarily a way to prove that it won't be used in the future. China does have, quite expansive national security laws itself, which does sort of compel individuals, businesses, etc., to provide information and intelligence to the government when the government, wants it or deems it to be important for national security. But that legislation or that law is quite broad, which means there's no way for TikTok and ByteDance to guarantee that the government would never call upon them to provide this information, even though, again, there's been no evidence that they've done it so far. So I think that's
Right.
the issue at hand. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious to hear what you think and if you have any thoughts about this.
Yeah, I would agree with you. A lot of the issue seems to be on forward looking, thinking about a world maybe where something happens. And that's a sense I got, that they're preparing for maybe a future where the US and China relations become more antagonistic. And then at that point, the Chinese government forces ByteDance to turn over, which, let's be real, I think in that case, the ByteDance would. So from that perspective, I fully understand why the US government is doing this. And it is pretty bipartisan. It seems like that people are in support of this ban. And I know TikTok has already been banned from at least government phones since I want to say like 2022. So that makes sense. The other part of it that seemed like I listened to a little bit of the congressional hearing, but the other part that seemed pretty huge in this was talk about the algorithm, TikTok's
Mhm.
algorithm, and how powerful the algorithm was, that it could pinpoint one person's unique interest and give them
Mhm.
tailored content, which I think we've all felt, just as you described that kind of eyes glazing, but you keep
Mhm.
watching, feeling. And what I gather, the fear about the algorithm, because the government has effectively said TikTok can sell and operate just as long as the algorithm is separated from TikTok. And what I gather from that is that the US government is worried that China perhaps would have access to exactly what information one person enjoys, and with that algorithm, give them or feed them information that might be suggestive against the US government or propaganda disguised in, funny cat videos or something like that.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I don't know if you saw, but there was I think TikTok made a suggestion or their lawyer made a suggestion. Well, can't we just put a disclaimer saying, FYI, things in here may be suggestive, or there might be suggestive content that you should discern for yourself whether you believe in it or not. And I think the representative on the government side said, no, that's like telling someone go into a grocery store, one out of 10,000 products in this store is going to cause cancer. It's not actionable.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Well, so you were in China recently, actually. And so I'm curious if you would like to speak a little bit about how the relationship between the US and China has changed. I know both of
Yeah.
us have experiences on both sides. So
Yeah.
what does this forebode for relations?
For relations, it's hard to tell as an individual in my kind of just visiting China, visiting the US, but there are some maybe structural things that I can notice. So for example, now going to China, there are a lot of restrictions around foreigners, both in terms of, um, for example, anytime a foreigner checks into a hotel, the hotel has 24 hours in which they have to report the location or the kind of like check-in of that foreigner to the government. And it seemed, I don't know if that was always the case in the past decade or whatever.
I don't think so.
Okay, if so,
Yeah.
it definitely wasn't as big of a deal as it is now.
Mm.
So that's one. There's also, and part of this second thing is around how high tech China has become, where China doesn't operate on cash anymore. It doesn't
Mhm.
even operate on credit cards. It operates on total digital payment transfers, where all you need to carry around is your phone. You scan a QR code and that money is transferred. But in order to do all of that, you have to set up a bunch of, it's tied to your identification. So as a foreigner, you have to set up all this information that they require of you to give you access to the basic things like paying for a bottle of water. So that definitely, I think you could say that just because of how high tech the country has become, but I do think there is an element of keeping a more close watch on
Mm.
foreigners.
I would agree. I mean, I think a closer watch on its own population as well. I think the government
Yeah.
has been one of the first to leverage some of this technology for its own objectives, right? And
Yeah.
I agree with you that I don't necessarily think the US's concerns are unsubstantiated, right? Or impossible or so such a large stretch of the imagination. I think it has very serious implications and perhaps precedent setting for what else may happen in the future. But I do agree that these are legitimate concerns. So maybe we bring it back to the present. So we do have a new president, and he has a different stance on what may happen to TikTok. So can you tell us a little bit more about what is happening here? And back to your question earlier of what has changed, right? He was the one who banned, the app in the first place, but now he seems more open to letting it continue on. Yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Well, the history lesson for anyone who hasn't followed this as closely, I think in 2020, in the middle of COVID, TikTok was just starting to blossom in the US. And at that point, President Trump proposed I don't know any of my legal terms. It's not a bill, proposed a motion or whatever to ban TikTok. And at that point, TikTok somehow last minute got it canceled or postponed or whatever it was. Anyways, fast forward, Biden took office and Biden canceled that whole thing. So for a while, there was nothing wrong with TikTok until later Biden did his own investigations and eventually prevented anyone from in the government from having TikTok on their phone. Now, fast forward, Biden's leaving office, and it seems like a last kind of hurrah of his is this whole motion again, and the Supreme Court gets involved, and it did seem like it was rushed to get this in just before the Trump inauguration. That maybe that administration really wanted to make sure this happened. But when Trump took office on his first day, he made an executive order, not a bill, an executive order. He put in an executive order to postpone this ban with 75 days. The idea being that TikTok has that amount of time to sell, or otherwise, I think there was potentially also, yeah. So basically, that now the only scenario is to sell, but in selling means to separate the algorithm from the rest of TikTok's assets, its people, its other technology to someone else. So I think it's interesting. What I felt about Trump coming into office and saying postponing this ban and under the premise that he needs time, his administration needs time to review it. On one hand, I think it makes sense, although it's interesting that he was one who proposed it in the first place, and now it may be a little bit of the hero of bringing it back. And in fact, on TikTok, I was seeing conspiracy theories that this was all just a way for Trump to look like a hero, which I don't believe that to be true. But it also seems a little bit like maybe an opportunity for lobbying that he has given now the market 75 days to, you know, voice their perspectives and who knows, donate, and see where that goes.
I mean, to be honest, I don't really know what to make of it. He's a negotiator, so I think he's trying to get something in exchange, right? So there has, I don't know how this would be done, if it would be done at all. But he has talked about, somehow the US taking a 50% stake in TikTok, right? So making it a 50-50 joint venture. Would that be the US government holding that stake? Would it be another private company buying out that stake? It's very, very unclear, but he has talked about that. And if we want to dive into real conspiracies, is who would then buy TikTok, right? If it was forced to sell, it's such a large company at this point. I don't know the valuation off the top of my head,
It
but
was
it's
like
in the
maybe I read some numbers that were like if you subtract the algorithm, maybe 20 billion. With the algorithm, it could be two or three times that.
Sure. Yeah. So a very large sum. So you could imagine that the number of companies that would be able to acquire, it would be very, very small. And we could probably name them on a single hand. So
Yeah.
it's also interesting who could potentially step forward as a buyer. And what benefits that would accrue to that company, right, and that ownership.
Yeah. Well, there's been talk about Elon Musk taking it over. He
Yeah.
could single-handedly purchase TikTok,
Yeah. Yeah.
although he probably has bigger aspirations now that he's in the Department of Government Efficiency and all of that. But
Yeah.
there's
Is it a good use
also
of government resources to buy a
that's
50%
true.
stake? Yeah,
That's true.
it might
There's
be. Who knows?
also, I think there was a who's the guy from Shark Tank, Mr. Why am I blanking on his name? But Kevin, anyways, one of the guys from Shark Tank, there's a coalition. I think they called it like the people's deal for TikTokers, but it sounded very PRC to me. So, but there's a whole coalition
Okay.
that's coming together with another pitch to buy it. And I think Mr. Beast, also the YouTube star,
YouTuber. Yeah.
also, yeah, so a lot of
It's
different things. But
fascinating.
what I think is really fascinating from this, talking about the business angle versus the government angle, is I think if you ask business people, China is an adversary to the extent that it seems like the government has positioned China to be. Very much so in this hearing, it was talking about China as an adversary and all of that. But I think if you talk to business people, like companies are doing deals with Chinese businesses, companies are maybe in some cases definitely threatened by China, like the electric car industry, but in other cases are actively seeing value from partnering with China and learning from China, even in some cases. And we don't treat China the way that we treat Russia or Cuba
Mm.
or North Korea, right? So for me, it's sending a signal that the government has some, hopefully, the government's more forward-looking when it comes to actual, state governance. That is their job. And it's sending me a signal that the government thinks China is a bigger threat than maybe society has caught up to.
Yeah. But to some extent, that is government's job, right? Like, areas that have to do with national security, have to do with competitiveness, have to do with, protecting US consumers. Again, I'm not saying that this is exactly what, it's doing, but this is what they claim it's doing, what the ban is
Yeah,
doing, right? But these questions, I do think belong to government rather than corporations who are, usually primarily concerned with
true.
business and profit. So I think it does make sense that the government is taking the lead on this. But again, the question is this, is this the right choice or not?
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I think is interesting is you have the government, which you're right, that's a good point, that it's not business's job to maybe define who the enemy is, right? That is government, you're right. But what's interesting is the backlash that we're seeing from especially Gen Z on TikTok,
Mm.
that Gen Z feels I had the sense that I got from watching some more Gen Z content on TikTok is that Gen Z feels lied to by the government. There were even points about how some people in Gen Z, so I don't want to take individual opinions and make them a whole statement about a generation, but there did seem to be some perspectives that, oh, at least China is authentic about who they are. And if they're taking our data, they're taking it, but they're taking it with our kind of they're telling us that. And by the way, apparently in Red Note, I have not confirmed this, but apparently in Red Note, in the terms and conditions when you sign up, there is something about how you will be a member of the Communist Party. Like there are apparently all of these. Yeah, I've had that app for many, many years. I honestly don't know,
You didn't
but
read
that's what I'm
the
reading.
terms when you
No, no. So there's also a lot of funny TikTok videos about people saying that they're like joining the Chinese army 50 years down the road because, or like they're on hold with the Chinese government because they didn't read the terms and conditions. So,
Yeah, they're secretly going to be conscripted. I mean, no doubt it's going to be unpopular, right? It's a massive source of entertainment and also an important source of like livelihood for a growing number of people now, right? Who make a lot of income off of that. And so I no doubt that there will be backlash. Yeah, it is, but I do agree it's interesting how it's sort of painting China in a more sympathetic light, which is perhaps counter to what they're what the government is trying to achieve.
Any hypotheses on what do you think TikTok sells in 75 days?
I have no idea. My understanding is those, again, a very limited insight into what the business itself is thinking. But I can't imagine they're not preparing for a bunch of different options, right? There's probably I mean, it's a massive organization at this point. They probably have teams of people looking at potential, exits. They have probably teams of people, continuing to whether lobby or pursue legal means or however they can prevent the ban from happening. So I assume they're making plans for all the potential variations that could pop up. But no, I don't know. I mean, it does seem to me like the president wants to get something in exchange. So it depends on whether TikTok is willing or able to give him something that satisfies him.
I think that's possible that they reach, maybe it's not a full sale, but that it's some kind of, as you said, stake that an American company has. I also wonder what the Chinese government, unfortunately, we don't know the China side, but I wonder
Yeah.
what's happening over there. Like, what does the Chinese media portray about this?
Yeah, so my understanding is that the Chinese government has been very opposed to the sale of the algorithm. So any sale that would potentially be done would have to get the approval of the Chinese authorities as well. And so far, it seems again, things are changing. Who knows? But again, so far it seems like there's been quite a lot of resistance from that side about the sale of the algorithm, which makes sense. I mean, part of it, again, who knows about this national security? Do they want this data, like, to have in their back
Yeah.
pocket? Who knows? But part of it too is it's very valuable, right? Like this is a very, very valuable company and it's a very, very valuable algorithm. And so there are financial incentives and as well as like technological innovation incentives to keep it. Um, and it's kind of interesting. I think the Chinese public is quite opposed as well, is my understanding. I think they see it as just a money grab from the US
From the US
government
government.
using their legal means to get a stake of something that is very lucrative. So I think that's the perception from the Chinese side.
Super interesting. We'll see
Yeah,
where this all goes. We'll be following closely.
yeah. I think it'll be a ride either way.